Richard Norton Smith is a nationally recognized authority on the American presidency. And to give you an idea of just what that means, if you Google his name, Richard Norton Smith, and you look at the first short bio that appears, guess what? It's the one at the White House. The White House holds the biography of this speaker. He's certainly also a familiar face to viewers of C-SPAN, as well as the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, where he appears regularly as part of the show's Roundtable of Historians. He was born in Leominster, Massachusetts, and he graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in 1975 with a degree in government. And following graduation, he worked as a White House intern, so he's on the inside. And he also got to view the White House from the outside when he was a writer for the Washington Post. And in 1977, he became a speechwriter for Massachusetts Senator Edward Brooke. 2 years later, he went to work for Senator Bob Dole, and he collaborated with the Doles on a couple of their books, actually 3 books in all. And between 1987 and 2006, Richard served as director of 5 presidential libraries: the Hoover, the Eisenhower, the Reagan, the Ford, which I've mentioned, and also, most recently, the Lincoln, which is a spectacular experience. In fact, when Richard and I were talking about what is the impact the Lincoln actually has on somebody who goes into it, it's very much, I describe it as akin to going into a movie. Very powerful emotional experience as well as a cerebral experience for all the things that you can learn about Abraham Lincoln. And I urge you to go to Springfield and have the experience yourself. Well, Richard's also known for his books. His first major book, Thomas Dewey and His Times, was a finalist for the 1983 Pulitzer Prize. He was still a callow man at that point, relatively young. Quite an achievement. He's also written An Uncommon Man, The Triumph of Herbert Hoover, The Harvard Century, and Patriarch, George Washington and the New American Nation. This is a book that we're going to be offering for sale through the week. The Colonel is also a very fine book. It's the life and legend of Robert McCormick, and it received the prestigious Goldsmith Prize awarded by Harvard's John F. Kennedy School, and has been described by Hilton Kramer as the best book ever written about the press. You also would know Richard, his work anyway, from all of the C-SPAN programs that he has done. Now, if you go back and look at the presidential series on C-SPAN from a couple of years ago, he has his imprint on that, but the current series on the 12 presidential libraries also shows his continuing involvement, and not just involvement in providing intellectual content, but Richard's creativity. He's a very creative director, entrepreneurial spirit when it comes to presenting the presidency to the American public. One of my favorite quotations by Richard is, "There's no excuse for a dull book, a dull museum, or a dull speech, especially when dealing with history, the most fascinating subject I know." Well, Richard, that's why we're here this afternoon. We can't wait to hear your remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Richard Norton Smith.
Thank you, Glees, and thank all of you coming out on this gorgeous day in West Michigan. It's almost too nice to be inside, but don't take that as a hint. Anyway, it's nice to come back. I feel so much at home in this place. Grand Rapids looks fantastic. I hear the rest of you in Michigan are having a few problems, but not for the first time. Grand Rapids seems to be leading the state. This is my first visit back here since January, and I'll be talking later this week about President Ford, but you don't need to hear it from me. That was an extraordinary week, not least of all because I think it was a showcase, really a global showcase. I know people I talked to in Washington who were just blown away by what they saw in this city. And of course, you know, those of us who know it better know that that's absolutely typical, is the reason why this was so dear to the president's heart and why he came back so often and finally. My topic this afternoon, and I hope very much after I talk that I hope we can talk, and that you might have some questions and we could have a real dialogue. But I got to thinking about how to kick off this series, and one subject that really runs throughout the whole history of the country and of the presidency, and for better or worse, it is the subject of war. topical, needless to say, but it would be topical if you stopped anywhere in the last 220 years. Don't hold me to this. I did some rough calculating, and I figured that 27 out of America's 43 presidents have been war presidents, which is a pretty amazing statistic when you stop to think about it. This is a country made by war. The Revolution obviously defined us. The War of 1812 reasserted our right to exist, independent of Great Britain. In the 1840s, the spirit of manifest destiny found violent expression in the Mexican War. At the end of the 19th century, somewhat to the chagrin of the sitting president, William McKinley, we edged out onto the world stage, and in many would argue we were converted almost overnight from a republic to an empire. And the consequences of that would come home to roost in repeated conflicts throughout the 20th century, including the Cold War, of which arguably both Korea and Vietnam are chapters. So anyway, I thought I would talk a little bit about this subject and to try to personalize it, as I hope to do all week long, to leave the theorizing to others and to try to humanize a very personal story. There are presidents who are wildly successful as war leaders, and there are others who are deservedly forgotten. You probably haven't talked much about James K. Polk lately. It's probably not a subject that comes up around many dinner tables, and perhaps for understandable reason. But, you know, one of the things I also want to suggest is there is no such thing as a final historical assessment. The facts may not change. There's probably a very limited amount of new information that any of us are going to dig up at this point about Polk or the Mexican-American War. What changes is us. Think of a kaleidoscope, and as you twist it and turn it, the horizon changes. The context changes. And the fact is that every generation, in some ways, brings its own perspective to that information. So for a very long time, if you sat down and opened a book, it didn't have to be Arthur Schlessinger's, almost anyone who was a student of the presidency, they'd tell you James K. Polk is a near great president. He's right up there, just below Theodore Roosevelt and just above Grover Cleveland. And the reason he was a near great president was because, one thing lots of us learned in school, he was the great expansionist. He added more physical territory to the United States than any other president. No small feat. Some of it he did through diplomacy, some of it he did through bluster and bluff, and some of it he did through military combat. The interesting thing is, in more recent years, Polk has been seen in an entirely different light. The Mexican-American War is no longer celebrated in most quarters. In fact, it is held against Polk. There are historians who regard it as a rather shabby chapter in the history of American diplomacy, for example. Polk is also an unusual president in that he said exactly what he was going to do when he became president, and then he did it. For better or worse, you don't have to like what he did. He said, you know, I have four things. First of all, he said, I'm going to be a one-term president, which is interesting. He was only 45 years old when he became president. He worked so hard, he died 3 months after he left office. Basically worked himself to death. God-fearing, devout Presbyterian. He and Mrs. Polk frowned on dancing and card playing. Sam Houston said the only thing wrong with the Polks was they drank too much water. And he brought that missionary zeal, if you will, to the presidency, and particularly to this notion of manifest destiny. Now, that's a phrase you've all heard. I would suggest it's almost religious in its connotation by the 1840s. This notion that the United States, there had always been this idea that America was exceptional, that God had placed us here for a purpose, that in fact He'd placed us between two oceans to protect us from being contaminated by the old world. You laugh, but you go back and read about manifest destiny.